While television screens focused on missile trajectories and retaliatory statements, a different set of movements unfolded quietly across shipping lanes, currency markets, and long-term energy contracts. In the span of days, insurance premiums for tankers crossing the Persian Gulf began to rise, not dramatically, but enough to shift routing decisions. At the same time, certain buyers in Asia increased purchases of discounted crude through intermediaries that rarely appear in official reports. No headlines explained this coordination. No briefings acknowledged it. Yet the pattern was visible to anyone tracking flows instead of speeches. The war itself was loud, immediate, and emotionally charged. The response from two major powers was none of those things. It was patient, it was calculated, and it was almost entirely indirect. When nations choose not to intervene directly, it does not mean they are absent. It often means they have found a more efficient position, one that extracts advantage without absorbing cost, one that allows another state to spend, to deploy, to exhaust. And in that silence, a deeper strategy begins to take shape. What you are about to see is not the war itself, but the structure forming quietly around it. If the conflict stretches for months, which country do you believe benefits most from America carrying the financial and military burden, and why? He reads shipping data before headlines, satellite images before statements, and financial flows before official narratives begin to form. Professor Liang Wu approaches conflict not as spectacle, but as a system of incentives, constraints, and hidden transactions. His work follows what moves quietly beneath public attention. If you are looking for analysis that goes where headlines stop, this is where it begins, and you may consider subscribing for that reason alone, as each episode builds a clearer map of how power actually operates. The immediate conflict involving Iran does not exist in isolation, and its significance in 2026 rests on its position within global energy and security systems. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly 20% of the world's petroleum liquids consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Even limited disruption introduces price volatility that affects economies far beyond the region. This is not theoretical. During previous periods of tension, even perceived risk has pushed Brent crude prices upward within days. At the same time, the United States continues to maintain extensive military commitments across the Middle East, with verify current troop deployment figures, personnel positioned across bases, and naval assets in the region. These deployments carry sustained financial costs measured in billions annually, according to Congressional Research Service estimates. Now consider the parallel economic realities. China remains the world's largest crude oil importer, with the International Energy Agency reporting imports exceeding 10 million barrels per day in recent years. A significant portion of this supply is sourced from politically sensitive regions, including the Middle East. Russia, meanwhile, has reoriented much of its energy export structure following sanctions imposed after the Ukraine conflict, redirecting flows toward Asia at discounted rates. Both countries operate within a system where price fluctuations, insurance costs, and shipping risks create opportunities as well as constraints. What emerges is a layered environment where one nation absorbs direct military expenditure while others adjust trade routes, negotiate pricing advantages, and strengthen long-term supply agreements. The International Monetary Fund has repeatedly noted how energy price shocks transmit globally, affecting inflation, currency stability, and growth forecasts across both developed and emerging economies. This means the consequences are not confined to battle zones. They appear in fuel prices, shipping costs, and ultimately in household budgets worldwide. The critical question is not simply who is fighting, but who is positioned to gain from the structure surrounding the fight. And to understand that structure, we need to examine how China and Russia are engaging without appearing to engage at all. The first layer of this situation is not about missiles, but about cost distribution. On the surface, the United States responds to instability with deployments, deterrence, and protection of maritime routes. This is consistent with decades of policy. The U.S. Fifth Fleet remains headquartered in Bahrain, tasked with securing critical waterways, including the Strait of Hormuz. Carrier strike groups rotate through the region, supported by air bases across the Gulf. These movements are visible, documented, and politically legible. They signal commitment. They also incur measurable expense. According to Congressional Budget Office estimates, sustaining forward-deployed naval forces and associated operations costs tens of billions annually when fully accounted across logistics, maintenance, and personnel cycles. But cost is not only financial, it is temporal and strategic. Every deployment cycle committed to one region is a cycle not available elsewhere. The Pentagon has repeatedly identified the Indo-Pacific as a priority theater in its national defense strategy. Yet the persistence of crises in the Middle East continues to draw resources back into a region Washington has attempted, at least rhetorically, to deprioritize. This is the first layer beneath the surface. Engagement here is not simply about immediate threats, it is about opportunity cost. Now consider the position of China. Officially, Beijing calls for de-escalation, stability, and respect for sovereignty. These statements align with its long-standing diplomatic posture, yet its material exposure is primarily economic, not military. China imports a significant portion of its oil from the Middle East, including from Iran, often through intermediary channels that obscure direct attribution in customs data. Reports from the International Energy Agency indicate sustained high levels of Chinese crude imports, with a portion linked to discounted barrels from sanctioned producers. In periods of volatility, discounts often deepen. Risk increases, price decreases. For a large importer, this dynamic can translate into strategic advantage, provided supply routes remain functional. This creates a subtle asymmetry. The United States invests in securing the flow. China benefits from the flow, often at adjusted pricing. One bears the visible burden of enforcement. The other extracts value within that enforced system. And this is where the arithmetic becomes more revealing. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting high-risk zones are calculated based on perceived threat levels. When tensions rise, premiums increase. This affects shipping costs globally. However, state-backed or state-aligned entities can absorb or mitigate these costs differently than private actors. Chinese firms, supported by large state-owned financial institutions, possess flexibility that smaller independent operators do not. This allows them to continue purchasing under conditions that might deter others. In effect, volatility filters out weaker participants while leaving larger, state-supported buyers in a stronger relative position. Russia occupies a different but complementary position. Following sanctions imposed after the Ukraine conflict, Russian energy exports were redirected toward Asia. According to publicly reported trade data, Russian crude has been sold at discounted rates to buyers including China and India. These arrangements often involve non-Western insurance mechanisms and alternative payment systems, reducing reliance on traditional financial channels. In a high-tension environment affecting Middle Eastern supply, Russian barrels become more attractive as substitutes. Price differentials narrow. Revenue stabilizes. Moscow benefits indirectly from disruptions it did not create. But look one layer deeper. The United States is not only spending resources. It is also reinforcing a global expectation. That expectation is that maritime security, particularly in choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, will ultimately be guaranteed by American presence. This expectation has been built over decades. It underpins global trade flows, yet it also creates a dependency structure. Other major economies rely on this security without proportionate contribution to its cost. Here is the point where most observers pause. They see burden sharing as an issue of alliance politics. They do not extend the analysis to strategic incentives. If one state consistently underwrites stability, others are incentivized to allocate their resources elsewhere. China can invest in infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative, expanding influence across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. Russia can focus on consolidating regional influence and adapting its economic networks under sanction pressure. Neither is required to match the scale of U.S. security expenditure in the Gulf. And this divergence compounds over time. Military budgets are finite, political attention is finite. Strategic patience, however, can be extended when costs are externalized. By allowing the United States to remain the primary security provider in a volatile region, China and Russia preserve their own flexibility. They avoid direct confrontation. They avoid escalation risks, yet they still shape outcomes through economic positioning and diplomatic signaling. This is not coordination in the formal sense. There is no treaty binding these actions into a unified strategy. But alignment does not require formal agreement. It emerges from shared incentives. And in this case, the incentive is clear. Let one actor carry the visible burden while others adjust quietly to maximize advantage. The surface narrative describes a conflict and a response. The deeper structure reveals a redistribution of cost and benefit that extends far beyond the battlefield, and it leads directly into the economic dimension that underpins the entire system. The second layer is not about who controls territory, but who controls price formation. At first glance, energy markets appear reactive. Prices rise when supply is threatened. Prices fall when stability returns. This seems mechanical. Yet beneath this apparent simplicity lies a complex web of contracts, benchmarks, and financial instruments that determine how value is actually captured. Brent crude and West Texas Intermediate serve as global benchmarks, but a growing share of oil trade now occurs through long-term bilateral agreements that operate partially outside these reference points. China has spent years expanding its capacity to engage in such arrangements. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange introduced yuan-denominated oil futures, offering an alternative pricing mechanism to dollar-based benchmarks. While the dollar remains dominant, the existence of parallel systems introduces optionality. In periods of geopolitical tension involving U.S.-aligned financial structures, this optionality becomes strategically significant. Now consider Iran's position within this system. Under extensive sanctions, Iran has developed methods to continue exporting oil through indirect channels. These include ship-to-ship transfers, reflagging of vessels, and sales through intermediaries. Independent analysts and organizations such as tanker trackers have documented these flows, though exact volumes vary and require careful verification. Much of this oil is believed to reach Asian markets, with China frequently identified as a primary destination. The presence of discounted Iranian crude introduces a dual pricing structure. Official market prices reflect regulated trade. Parallel flows operate at negotiated discounts. During periods of heightened tension, these discounts can widen as sellers seek to move product under increased risk. Buyers capable of navigating this environment gain access to cheaper energy inputs. For a manufacturing-driven economy, lower input costs translate directly into competitive advantage. But there is a complication. Reliance on discounted or sanctioned supply carries political and logistical risk. Shipping routes may be disrupted, payment channels may be scrutinized, insurance coverage may be limited. This creates a balancing act. States like China must weigh the benefits of lower prices against the risks of overexposure to unstable supply chains. This is why diversification remains central. Middle Eastern imports are balanced with Russian supply, African sources, and domestic production where possible. Russia's role within this structure is evolving. After Western sanctions restricted access to traditional markets, Russia developed what analysts often call a shadow fleet, vessels operating with opaque ownership structures and non-Western insurance. This fleet facilitates continued exports to buyers willing to engage outside conventional frameworks. According to various reports, including those referenced by the International Energy Agency, these flows have allowed Russia to maintain significant export volumes despite sanctions. Now step one layer deeper. Energy is not only a commodity. It is a transmission mechanism for financial influence. The global dominance of the US dollar in energy transactions has historically reinforced American economic power. Sanctions, in particular, derive much of their effectiveness from control over dollar clearing systems. When alternative payment mechanisms emerge, even at limited scale, they begin to erode this leverage incrementally. China's development of cross-border payment systems, alongside Russia's efforts to expand non-dollar trade, represents a gradual shift rather than a sudden transformation. The share of global energy trade conducted outside the dollar remains relatively small. However, the direction of movement is strategically relevant. Each transaction conducted in alternative currencies reduces marginal dependence on dollar-based systems. And this is where the deeper tension emerges. The United States is simultaneously enforcing sanctions, maintaining security commitments, and sustaining the financial architecture that underpins global trade. These roles can reinforce each other, but they can also create friction. Enforcement actions may encourage targeted states to develop alternatives. Security commitments may enable those same states to continue exporting through protected routes, indirectly benefiting from the stability provided by the enforcing power. Pause here for a moment. The system begins to look less like a simple hierarchy and more like an interdependent structure with competing incentives. The United States seeks to maintain order and influence. China and Russia seek to operate within that order while gradually adjusting its terms. Iran seeks to survive within constraints by exploiting gaps in enforcement and demand. The result is not a clean separation of roles, but an overlapping set of strategies that interact in unpredictable ways. Countries often absent from Western-centered analysis also play a role. India, for example, has significantly increased imports of discounted Russian crude since 2022, according to multiple international reports. These imports are refined and in some cases re-exported as petroleum products. This creates a secondary layer of value capture. Turkey has similarly acted as an intermediary in certain trade flows, balancing its NATO membership with pragmatic economic engagement. These actors do not drive the system, but they shape its contours in meaningful ways. The visible conflict in Iran influences all of these dynamics by altering risk calculations. It does not determine them entirely. It acts as a catalyst within an already evolving structure. And as these economic adjustments accumulate, they begin to influence something even less visible but more enduring than price or supply. The next layer moves beyond markets into the architecture of global alignment itself. What follows is the dimension most frequently overlooked because it unfolds slowly and without clear headlines. At the deepest level, this situation is reshaping how states think about alignment without alliance. Traditional alliances are formal. They involve treaties, mutual defense commitments, and clearly defined obligations. NATO is the most prominent example. Its Article 5 commitment establishes that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This creates clarity. It also creates rigidity. States bound by such commitments must respond in ways that align with treaty obligations, even when national interests are complex. China and Russia operate differently in this context. Their relationship has been described in official statements as a partnership without limits, though practical cooperation remains bounded by national interests. There is no mutual defense treaty comparable to NATO, yet there is increasing coordination in areas such as military exercises, energy trade, and diplomatic positioning in international forums like the United Nations Security Council. This looser form of alignment offers flexibility. It allows both states to coordinate where interests overlap while avoiding entanglement where they diverge. In the context of the Iran conflict, this flexibility is advantageous. Neither China nor Russia is obligated to intervene directly. Both can calibrate their involvement based on evolving conditions. Now consider Iran itself. Iran is not a formal ally of either China or Russia in the treaty sense. However, it occupies a strategic position within both countries' broader calculations. For China, Iran is a component of westward connectivity under the Belt and Road Framework. A 25-year cooperation agreement signed in 2021 outlines potential investments in infrastructure and energy, though implementation details remain partially opaque. For Russia, Iran represents both a regional partner and a shared interest in counterbalancing U.S. influence. This creates a network of relationships that are not codified as alliances but function as strategic alignments. They are resilient precisely because they are not rigid. They can adapt, they can deepen or loosen without formal renegotiation. Look one layer deeper. This model of alignment reduces the cost of participation in global competition. States can cooperate without committing to full spectrum support. They can benefit from association without assuming full risk. In a world where direct great power conflict carries unacceptable escalation potential, this model becomes increasingly attractive. But it also introduces ambiguity. When commitments are informal, responses to crises become less predictable. This uncertainty complicates deterrence. Traditional deterrence relies on clear signals of response. Ambiguity weakens those signals, or at least makes them harder to interpret. This can lead to miscalculation, and here lies the strategic dilemma. The United States operates within a system of formal alliances that provide clarity but require consistent demonstration of commitment. China and Russia operate within a system of flexible alignments that provide adaptability but introduce uncertainty. Each model has strengths. Each has vulnerabilities. If the current trajectory continues, we may see a gradual shift toward hybrid structures, where states maintain formal alliances while simultaneously engaging in flexible partnerships outside those frameworks. This would create a more fragmented but also more resilient global order, where influence is distributed across overlapping networks rather than concentrated within rigid blocks. Such a shift would not be announced. It would emerge through patterns of behavior, through decisions not to act as much as decisions to act. And this is the point where the analysis returns to the present moment. The conflict involving Iran is not only a regional crisis, it is a stress test for these evolving models of alignment. It reveals how states respond when formal obligations are absent, when incentives diverge, and when the cost of direct involvement is high. If the United States continues to absorb the primary security burden while others adjust around it, this pattern may solidify into a durable feature of the international system. If, however, Washington recalibrates its commitments or demands greater burden sharing, the structure could shift in ways that are difficult to predict. Either path carries consequences that extend far beyond this specific conflict, and they lead directly into the final layer of analysis. If this form of analysis is reaching you and you want it to continue, then subscribing and sharing it is how that becomes possible. It allows time and attention to be spent where surface narratives end and deeper structures begin, and it signals that serious, evidence-based work still has an audience willing to engage with it carefully. The factor most consistently overlooked is not external strategy, but internal constraint. Every external posture you have observed is filtered through domestic political reality, and that reality imposes limits that strategy alone cannot override. In the United States, sustained overseas military engagement now exists within a far more contested political environment than it did 2 decades ago. Congressional debates over defense spending, war powers, and foreign commitments have become increasingly polarized. According to data from the Congressional Research Service, U.S. military operations in the Middle East since 2001 have cost trillions of dollars when long-term obligations are included. That number is not abstract inside domestic politics. It shapes voter sentiment. It shapes legislative behavior. It shapes how long any administration can maintain a costly external posture without visible progress. Now place that constraint against the current situation. A prolonged conflict involving Iran, even without full-scale war, requires persistent deployment. Naval assets, air defense systems, intelligence resources. Each additional month carries cost. Each escalation increases risk of entanglement. And each development is evaluated not only by military planners, but by domestic audiences whose tolerance for extended conflict is finite. China operates under a different internal structure, but it is not unconstrained. Economic stability remains central to political legitimacy. The Chinese economy has faced slowing growth rates in recent years, with the World Bank noting deceleration compared to previous decades. Energy security is therefore not simply a strategic issue, it is a domestic necessity. Disruptions that significantly raise import costs or threaten supply continuity carry internal consequences. This creates a strong incentive for stability without direct involvement. Beijing's posture reflects that balance. It seeks continuity of supply without exposure to conflict. Russia faces its own internal pressures. Sanctions have reshaped its economic structure, forcing adaptation toward alternative markets and financial systems. According to the International Monetary Fund, Russia's economy has demonstrated resilience in certain sectors despite restrictions, but this resilience depends heavily on sustained energy revenue. Any global development that stabilizes or increases demand for Russian exports supports domestic economic continuity. At the same time, direct involvement in another major conflict would stretch military and economic capacity already engaged elsewhere. And then there is Iran itself. Iran's internal dynamics are complex and often reduced to simple narratives. Economic pressure from sanctions has been significant, affecting currency stability and inflation rates, as documented by international financial institutions. Yet the state has maintained operational capacity and regional influence. This persistence is not accidental. It reflects a system that has adapted to constraint over time. For Iranian leadership, external pressure can also reinforce internal cohesion, particularly when framed as resistance to external interference. Look one layer deeper. Each of these domestic contexts produces a shared but unspoken outcome. None of the major actors involved has a strong internal incentive to escalate into full-scale confrontation. The United States faces political and financial limits. China prioritizes economic continuity. Russia manages constrained resources. Iran balances external pressure with internal resilience. This does not produce peace. It produces managed tension. Conflicts can persist at levels that remain below thresholds that would trigger domestic backlash or systemic disruption. This is the space where proxy actions, limited strikes, and indirect engagement become the dominant forms of interaction. It is not stability in the traditional sense. It is controlled instability. And this is the detail that most coverage misses. The absence of full-scale war is not necessarily the presence of resolution. It can be the result of intersecting constraints that prevent escalation while allowing underlying tensions to continue indefinitely. If those constraints shift, the entire structure changes. Watch the internal signals, not just the external actions. Changes in public opinion, economic stress indicators, or leadership priorities often precede shifts in external behavior. They are quieter, but they are often more decisive. With that in place, the analysis can now be drawn together into a single coherent picture. So what does all of this actually tell us? The visible conflict is only the outer layer of a much larger system of incentives and constraints operating simultaneously. The United States secures maritime routes through deployments like the Fifth Fleet, sustaining a system that allows global energy flows to continue despite risk. China, as the world's largest crude importer according to the International Energy Agency, benefits from those flows while adjusting purchasing strategies to capture discounted supply where possible. Russia, under sanctions following the Ukraine conflict, redirects exports toward Asia, maintaining revenue through alternative networks documented in international energy reports. These three dynamics do not operate separately. They reinforce each other in a structure where cost, risk, and benefit are unevenly distributed. At the same time, alternative financial and trade mechanisms, including yuan-denominated contracts and non-Western insurance systems, introduce gradual shifts in how energy is priced and paid for. This does not replace existing systems immediately, but it alters their margins over time. Layered on top of this is a changing model of alignment. Formal alliances provide clarity but demand commitment, while flexible partnerships allow coordination without obligation. China and Russia operate within this flexibility, engaging where interests align without assuming full exposure. And beneath all of it, domestic constraints shape what each actor can sustain. Political limits in the United States, economic priorities in China, adaptive pressures in Russia, and resilience within Iran all restrict the range of possible actions. Taken together, this is not a single conflict. It is an interlocking system. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. The evidence does not point toward an inevitable escalation, but it does point toward a prolonged period of managed tension with intermittent shocks. The key variables to watch are specific and measurable. First, any sustained disruption to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz beyond short-term incidents would alter the cost structure immediately. Second, changes in U.S. force posture, particularly reductions or redeployments, would signal a shift in willingness to bear ongoing burden. Third, adjustments in Chinese or Indian purchasing patterns, especially visible in customs or tanker tracking data, would indicate how energy flows are adapting in real time. None of these indicators alone determines the outcome. Together, they form a pattern. If that pattern begins to shift, the structure you have seen in this analysis will begin to change with it. Until then, expect continuity shaped by constraint rather than resolution. This analysis is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing presented here constitutes policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The perspectives expressed reflect an independent analytical interpretation based on publicly available information from credible international sources. The voiceover used in this video is generated using artificial intelligence technology. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources, examine primary data where possible, and form their own informed conclusions about the issues discussed in this analysis. Understanding how the world actually functions requires patience and discipline. It requires looking beyond statements and observing structures that operate quietly over time. That effort is not passive. It shapes how you interpret events, how you assess risk, and how you understand the direction of global change. Share this with one person who you believe is paying attention but missing the deeper pattern. Leave a comment with your own assessment or the country you are watching most closely right now. The algorithm responds to engagement, and that engagement determines whether analysis like this continues to reach those who are willing to think carefully. The next development will not announce itself when it begins. I am Professor Liang Wu. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.